He was called a reckless child in uniform. At just 35, Ibrahim Traoré was humiliated on live television by a senior statesman in Nairobi who mocked his youth and threatened legal action over his radical push for new African money and complete self-reliance. The room laughed. Reporters nodded. Africa needs stability, they said, not revolution. But what they didn't know was this: behind Traoré's silence was a sealed dossier, names, accounts, betrayals, proof that the very leaders preaching unity were selling Africa piece by piece. That day wasn't his defeat. It was the day Africa's reckoning began. If you believe that even a small nation can stand tall against great power, if you believe that Africa deserves to write its own destiny, if you see the unyielding fire in Captain Traoré's eyes, then like the video and subscribe to the channel, not just to support, but to stand with us. Stand with a wave of awakening, a wave of pride, of the new African spirit. This is not just the story of Burkina Faso. This is a call to all who still believe in justice, freedom, and honor. Together, we won't just witness history, we will write it. In a packed auditorium in Nairobi, the atmosphere shifted from anticipation to tension as General Madaki, a long-standing statesman known for his ties to international financial institutions, took the microphone. His target was clear: Ibrahim Traoré. With a smirk, Madaki declared, "Young men with rifles and dreams will destroy what took decades to build." The crowd murmured. Cameras rolled. He went further, warning that Traoré's push for new African money, a currency independent of the CFA and Western banks, was not just reckless, but potentially criminal. If Burkina Faso continues this path, he said, international legal action will be considered. Traoré sat silently in the front row, his eyes steady, unmoved. The insults weren't new. He had been called a populist, a radical, even a pawn of Russian influence. But what no one in that room knew was that the documents in his briefcase would soon flip the narrative entirely. Hours after the summit, his communications team released a leak: financial records, internal emails, and confidential memos, exposing a quiet coalition of African elites who had taken bribes to keep the CFA alive and suppress alternatives. General Madaki's name appeared on multiple transfers. The backlash was immediate and explosive. Youth groups and activists across Africa took to social media, not to defend Traoré, but to demand justice. The narrative shifted overnight. The man who had been mocked as a naive dreamer now stood as a whistleblower against corruption entrenched in the very institutions that had long claimed to speak for Africa. Traoré had not just survived the attack, he had weaponized it. The courtroom threat meant to silence him became the spark that ignited African unity. In the days that followed the Nairobi summit, international media painted Ibrahim Traoré as a destabilizing figure. Western outlets ran headlines like, "Traoré threatens economic stability in West Africa," and "Burkina Faso's rogue leader risks sanctions." A spokesperson for a major European bank even went on record calling Traoré's economic vision a fantasy rooted in rebellion. The narrative was clear: Traoré was reckless, isolated, and a threat to the global financial order. Rumors swirled that the IMF was preparing a joint response with ECOWAS to freeze Burkina Faso's foreign reserves. Legal threats began to materialize from former colonial partners, thinly veiled in diplomatic language but sharp in intent. But just as pressure mounted, Traoré executed a quiet counterstrike. He invited a panel of independent African economists to Ouagadougou and presented his detailed blueprint for new African money. It wasn't a chaotic revolution. It was a methodical strategy grounded in gold reserves, regional trade corridors, and a blockchain-backed currency system to prevent foreign manipulation. Every step had been calculated, reviewed, and secured by a coalition of Pan-African academics and technocrats who had been working in the shadows for over a year. When the plan was made public, it stunned even his critics. This wasn't rebellion. It was a renaissance. Countries like Mali, Guinea, and Chad expressed interest. Youth leaders in Senegal and Côte d'Ivoire flooded the streets, chanting, "Self-reliance now." Suddenly, the man who had been accused of economic ignorance became a visionary. Traore had turned misunderstanding into momentum. What they called a fantasy was, in fact, Africa's most daring financial awakening in decades. And for the first time in generations, the dream of African self-reliance no longer sounded like a myth, it felt like a plan. At a high-level African Union Economic Roundtable in Addis Ababa, Ibrahim Traoré was once again met with cold eyes and closed minds. One delegate from a North African nation sarcastically questioned whether Burkina Faso even had the technological literacy to lead financial innovation. The jab was veiled as a joke, but its intent was sharp, an insult wrapped in elitism. Others nodded, dismissing Traoré's idea of a pan-African cryptocurrency as digital madness and a threat to regional stability. A well-known central bank official warned openly that such moves could trigger legal scrutiny from international watchdogs. Once again, Traoré stood alone, accused of arrogance and overreach. But this time, he had come prepared, not with just words, but with proof. As the murmurs echoed around the conference hall, Traoré calmly requested the floor. What followed was not a speech, it was a revelation. He unveiled the new African money prototype. A blockchain-based currency designed not in Paris or London, but by a Pan-African tech coalition headquartered in Ouagadougou. He showed real-time transaction demonstrations between farmers in Mali and merchants in Ghana using the system. He presented encrypted data showing full transparency, security, and resilience against foreign currency manipulation. He even shared a live statement from a South African auditing firm verifying the integrity of the technology. What had seemed like fantasy days before now stood before the assembly as functioning reality. The room changed. Delegates who had laughed now whispered to each other. The North African representative, previously smug, was seen taking notes. Journalists rushed to update their coverage. It became clear, Traoré had not only imagined a financial revolution, he had already launched it. And with every country that opted in, the grip of the CFA franc, the euro, and the dollar weakened on the continent. More than the technology, it was the symbolism that pierced through. Traoré had redefined leadership, not as obedience to inherited systems, but as the courage to build new ones. He had taken humiliation, discrimination, and threats of legal action and turned them into fuel. The mockery became momentum. The resistance became validation. As nations began asking how to join the system, it was no longer about whether Traoré was right. It was about how soon they could catch up. If you believe that even a small nation can stand tall against great power. If you believe that Africa deserves to write its own destiny. If you see the unyielding fire in Captain Traoré's eyes. Then like the video and subscribe to the channel, not just to support, but to stand with us. Stand with a wave of awakening, a wave of pride, of the new African spirit. This is not just the story of Burkina Faso. This is a call to all who still believe in justice, freedom, and honor. Together, we won't just witness history. We will write it. What began as one man's vision was now Africa's movement. The new African money was no longer just currency. It was a statement of identity, sovereignty, and defiance. A sign that African unity was not only possible, but profitable. And Ibrahim Traoré, once dismissed as a reckless soldier, had just redrawn the financial map of an entire continent. At the World Economic Forum in Geneva, Ibrahim Traoré received a cold reception from Western leaders. During a panel on global financial inclusion, a European diplomat subtly implied that Burkina Faso's push for new African money was a destabilizing experiment that could invite sanctions or diplomatic consequences. Another Western economist questioned the capacity of African nations to manage a decentralized financial system without foreign oversight. Though the comments were wrapped in formal language, the message was clear: Traore was not welcome. He was framed as a disruptive outsider, a threat to the neatly controlled financial networks that had long governed African economies from afar. The insult didn't stop there. A leaked memo later revealed that 3 European states had pressured international banks to limit transactions with institutions linked to Burkina Faso. The threat was real. Traoré's ambition for African self-reliance had triggered the very machinery he sought to escape. But what the global elite didn't expect was the wave of resistance their actions would provoke. Instead of retreating, Traoré doubled down. He returned to Burkina Faso and announced a bold economic alliance with Mali, Guinea, and Niger, a coalition that would trade using the new African money and share reserves in gold and agricultural commodities. Within weeks, Ethiopia and Chad expressed interest. Even outside Africa, nations sympathetic to post-colonial resistance began to observe the experiment with curiosity and respect. Meanwhile, African civil society erupted with support. Artists created murals of Traoré wrapped in digital circuitry. University students in Kenya organized public lectures on blockchain sovereignty. Farmers' cooperatives in Senegal announced pilot programs using the new currency for seed distribution and trade. Across the continent, the movement was no longer about one man, it was about reclaiming control, restoring pride, and rewriting the rules. And in a moment of poetic irony, one of the very banks that had warned of destabilization reached out privately to open exploratory talks about integrating aspects of the system into their African operations. Traoré, ever disciplined, declined. "We are no longer for sale," he stated publicly. Africa is building for Africans. What began as a veiled threat in Geneva had ignited a continent-wide fire. The attempt to isolate Traoré had only amplified his influence. His vision of African unity and financial independence had moved from defiance to design, from whispers to infrastructure. And as more nations lined up to join, it became clear that the age of externally managed African economies was closing. Not with violence. Not with revenge. But with innovation, and the quiet, unstoppable momentum of a people reclaiming their future. In a confidential diplomatic letter leaked to the press, a senior West African official accused Ibrahim Traoré of economic sabotage and jeopardizing regional security through his promotion of new African money. The letter was laced with legal threats and warnings about potential expulsion from key African financial institutions. The accusation was severe. It implied that Traoré's currency model was not just a disruption, but a danger, possibly grounds for legal action under regional economic charters. Within hours, media outlets across the continent were flooded with headlines like, "Traoré faces sanctions for reckless financial reforms," and, "Is Burkina Faso risking West Africa's economic stability?" If you believe that even a small nation can stand tall against great power. If you believe that Africa deserves to write its own destiny. If you see the unyielding fire in Captain Traoré's eyes. Then like the video and subscribe to the channel, not just to support, but to stand with us. Stand with a wave of awakening, a wave of pride, of the new African spirit. This is not just the story of Burkina Faso. This is a call to all who still believe in justice, freedom, and honor. Together, we won't just witness history, we will write it. Traoré remained silent. Not because he lacked a response, but because he was preparing a storm. Behind closed doors, he had already anticipated this backlash. He knew that any effort to break Africa's financial chains would provoke the old guard. Those whose power depended on dependency. What they didn't know was that new African money was no longer just a theory or a digital experiment. It was a functioning network, tested across border towns, refined through months of collaboration with African technologists, and quietly adopted by rural communities who had long been excluded from global financial systems. Days after the leak, Traore delivered a televised address from a solar-powered data center in northern Burkina Faso. He stood in front of a glowing map showing real-time transactions taking place across Mali, Guinea, and even parts of the Democratic Republic of Congo, conducted entirely in the new African money system. His tone was calm, almost surgical. "We are not destroying unity," he said. "We are rebuilding it from the ground up, with dignity, not debt." Then came the shockwave. Traore unveiled that over 3 million Africans had voluntarily migrated to the new financial system. From fishermen in Senegal to shopkeepers in Benin, people were choosing sovereignty over subjugation. The platform, built with open-source protocols and community governance, had become a financial sanctuary, a place where African economies could grow without fear of devaluation, manipulation, or foreign interest rate hikes. International observers scrambled. Some tried to discredit the numbers. Others demanded access to verify the technology. The World Bank issued a concerned statement, warning of market fragmentation. But on the ground, something irreversible had begun. Entire villages in the Sahel stopped accepting the CFA franc. Cooperatives in Togo used the new system to purchase farming equipment directly from local manufacturers. The bureaucracy that once controlled every transaction, banks, ministries, and intermediaries, was now bypassed by a tool that lived in every smartphone and solar-powered terminal across the continent. Meanwhile, the accusations against Traore began to unravel. Independent journalists uncovered that the official who authored the original economic sabotage letter had personal ties to foreign contractors who profited from currency printing deals with European firms. The so-called threat wasn't to regional stability, it was to their profit margins. As the truth surfaced, public perception shifted radically. Protests broke out, not against Traore, but against the institutions trying to silence him. Young Africans held signs reading, "Our money, our future," and "Unity without chains." In universities from Dakar to Addis Ababa, students demanded curriculum reforms to include African economic history and the technologies behind new African money. Musicians released tracks celebrating the digital revolution. The movement was no longer political, it was cultural, emotional, generational. Even outside Africa, the world began to watch differently. Latin American economists praised the model. Indigenous communities in Southeast Asia sent letters of solidarity. A Pan-African Tech Summit in Nairobi was overwhelmed with applications from developers, entrepreneurs, and investors eager to build around Traore's system. What had started as a regional challenge had become a global case study in economic decolonization. But perhaps the most profound moment came in a quiet village near the Burkina-Malian border. An elderly woman, who had never used a bank in her life, was interviewed by a local radio station. When asked why she trusted the new system, she simply replied, "Because it doesn't speak in foreign tongues. It speaks to me, in my language, with my values." That was the essence of Traore's revolution. It wasn't just about digital currency or economic reform. It was about voice, ownership, identity. African self-reliance wasn't an ideology, it was becoming a lived experience. And in reclaiming the right to shape their own future, millions of Africans had done something far greater than defy legal threats or foreign pressure, they had redrawn the meaning of freedom itself. Ibrahim Traoré didn't just fight to change a system. He built a new one, and invited a continent to walk into it. Not with fear, but with pride. Not with permission, but with power. And though the old order had tried to bury him in paper threats and political attacks, they had underestimated one thing, the quiet, unstoppable force of people who finally believe that what they build is theirs to keep. The story of Ibrahim Traoré's rise and his daring push for new African money is more than a political transformation. It is a masterclass in leadership, courage, and the pursuit of dignity. At its heart lies a lesson that has echoed across generations but is too often forgotten. Real change begins not with permission, but with conviction. Traoré never waited for the approval of global powers or old elites. He acted. He took initiative in a system designed to crush initiative, and in doing so, reminded an entire continent that sovereignty is not granted, it is seized. One of the clearest lessons is that misunderstanding and mockery often mask fear. From the moment Traoré introduced his vision, he was ridiculed. He was dismissed as too young, too naive, too idealistic. But the backlash he faced was not rooted in the implausibility of his ideas, it was rooted in the danger they posed to those who benefited from the status quo. The louder the opposition became, the clearer it was that he was touching a nerve. True leadership, Traoré teaches us, is not measured by applause in the room, but by the discomfort it causes in those who profit from injustice. Another powerful lesson lies in preparation. Traoré was not impulsive. While his speeches were bold, his actions were deliberate. Long before the world paid attention, he had gathered technologists, economists, and thinkers who helped build the infrastructure for new African money. By the time the criticism came, he already had results. This teaches us the importance of strategic patience, of building quietly, preparing thoroughly, and acting when the time is right. Success is not just about vision, it's about readiness. There is also a deep lesson about narrative control. For decades, the story of African development was written by outsiders. The IMF, the World Bank, former colonial powers, all shaped the language of aid, stability, and growth in a way that served their interests. Traoré disrupted that narrative. He refused to let others define what progress meant for Burkina Faso or for Africa. In reclaiming the language of development, he restored something even more valuable, the right for Africans to speak for themselves. That is the foundation of true dignity. If you believe that even a small nation can stand tall against great power, if you believe that Africa deserves to write its own destiny, if you see the unyielding fire in Captain Traoré's eyes, then like the video and subscribe to the channel, not just to support, but to stand with us. Stand with a wave of awakening, a wave of pride, of the new African spirit. This is not just the story of Burkina Faso. This is a call to all who still believe in justice, freedom, and honor. Together, we won't just witness history, we will write it. The backlash Traoré faced also offers a hard but vital lesson about resistance. When you challenge entrenched power, retaliation is inevitable. He faced economic threats, legal accusations, and political isolation. But instead of folding under pressure, he transformed it into momentum. He exposed corruption, rallied youth. In doing so, he reminded us that resistance must be met with resilience, and that every attempt to silence a just voice only increases its volume. Perhaps the most profound lesson is that systems only seem unchangeable until someone dares to change them. The CFA franc, foreign-controlled debt, externally dictated trade agreements, these were seen as facts of African life. Traoré shattered that illusion. He demonstrated that alternatives not only exist, but can thrive when grounded in cooperation, trust, and shared purpose. This is a radical shift, from dependency to design. From survival to sovereignty. From helplessness to authorship. His journey also highlights the role of technology in liberation. In the past, resistance movements relied on guns and protests. Today, Traoré showed that financial coding, blockchain transparency, and mobile accessibility can be just as revolutionary. New African money wasn't built in banks, it was built in data centers and by communities. This tells us that the future of freedom lies not just in politics, but in innovation. And that Africa's brightest weapon against exploitation might be its youth, its code, and its creativity. Another lesson is the unifying power of vision. Traoré's proposal wasn't just economic policy, it was a dream that millions could recognize. It spoke to farmers who had been locked out of formal economies, students who wanted dignity in education, and mothers who wanted fair prices for their goods. A true leader, as Traoré shows us, speaks not to the elites but to the forgotten. And when people see themselves in a vision, they will carry it further than any politician ever could. Finally, the most lasting lesson from Traoré's journey is about legacy. He is not just creating a system, he is creating a shift in mindset. Young Africans now grow up hearing that they can design their own futures. That they can question, challenge, and replace what doesn't serve them. That they are not the passive recipients of development but the active architects of it. This is the ultimate victory, not just of policy, but of imagination. In the end, the story of Ibrahim Traoré and New African Money is not about one man. It is about a continent remembering its worth. It is about a generation that refuses to wait for permission. It is about the quiet, determined rise of a people who know that freedom is not a gift, it is a right. And when that right is claimed boldly, patiently, and collectively, it becomes unstoppable. Across the continent and far beyond its borders, the reaction to Ibrahim Traoré's bold economic vision has been nothing short of electric. In comment sections, radio call-ins, and street conversations, people from all walks of life are expressing admiration, hope, and renewed belief in African potential. One viewer from Mali wrote, "For the first time in my life, I see a leader who speaks not like a politician, but like one of us." Traoré isn't promising handouts, he's promising dignity. That sentiment was echoed by a teacher in Senegal, who commented, "I've been teaching economics for 15 years, and never has a local solution stirred my classroom the way New African Money has. My students are finally asking the right questions, not about loans, but about ownership. If you believe that even a small nation can stand tall against great power. If you believe that Africa deserves to write its own destiny. If you see the unyielding fire in Captain Traoré's eyes. Then like the video and subscribe to the channel, not just to support, but to stand with us. Stand with a wave of awakening, a wave of pride, of the new African spirit. This is not just the story of Burkina Faso. This is a call to all who still believe in justice, freedom, and honor. Together, we won't just witness history, we will write it." A Kenyan software engineer praised the integration of blockchain in the financial system, saying, "This is the first time I've seen African leadership embrace modern tech to solve real problems." Traoré isn't just talking about sovereignty, he's coding it into our future. Meanwhile, a grandmother in Côte d'Ivoire sent a voice message that went viral, "I never trusted banks. They spoke a language I couldn't understand. But this new money, my son showed me how to use it. It's simple. And it's ours."